Welcome to another edition of the Influence Global podcast, and I'm delighted to have with me a very special guest, and that is Bernard Achampong, who is the creative director and the founder of Unedited, which is a production company, and you work with all sorts of creative people around podcasts and things. So we have the podcast element as similarities. So we're going to talk today about being an entrepreneur around some of your content. And I think it's really interesting subject, actually, Bernard, because sometimes people, they produce content because they think it's going to deliver the results. And sometimes it lacks purpose. I mean, I was running a session at the podcast show around monetizing your content, and it was massive in terms of the amount of people that attended. So it is a challenge for some creators because they think their content will deliver, but sometimes don't always know what it is. So anyway, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So how did you get started before you became the creative director? What was your sort of background before this?
So I was essentially bopping around the BBC trying to take on any opportunity that interested me, but it didn't seem to come together as a cohesive package. I did some work on the Today program. I worked for the World Service. I worked in the Religion and Ethics department. I worked on the pop radio stations. So there's a lot of things I was doing, but there didn't seem to be a clear direction in terms of what I wanted to do. I think the breakthrough came for me when I had a conversation about diversity. Which always seems like a well-trodden path. But the insight I got in this case was diversity wasn't a problem, diversity was an opportunity.
Interesting, yeah.
And by thinking about it that way, what would your organization look like if it was more diverse? What would it be doing differently and better than other organizations? And how could you capitalize on that? And that led me into setting up Unedited, which really is about what would a diverse organization look like if there were no limits, if there were no quotas, if there were no, well, we've got 3 Asian women and 4 from the LGBT community. And, when you take all those limits off, what does your company actually look like?
Fascinating. Yeah. So now, let's talk about some of the creators that you've helped and supported, and more specifically, on how do they come to you? Do you find them or do they find you? How does that marriage work?
Well, it's a mixture of both. We started off by looking for creators and finding people who wanted to use the growing world of podcasting, which is what we started. To say, well, would you like to make a podcast? We can help you make it. And as time's gone on, we've had people come to us, both the creators and the distributors, the platforms, the BBC, Spotify's, Audibles, come to us and say, actually, we've either got talent that we'd like you to work with, or we've got an opportunity. Would you like to put something in? Would you like to create something for us or create something with us?
So give me some examples of some of the people that you've worked with and how you've helped them on their journey.
Sure. So we worked with people like Julie Adenuga, who's from a great music family with her brother being Skepta and JME. And we've given her her first full podcast, which allows her to be a lot more documentary style rather than formatted. We've worked with Joella Noble, who is a new up and coming presenter. We actually worked on a couple of formats with her before, first as part of a talk show and then part of a sneaker podcast. And now she's one of the flagship presenters on One Extra through our One Extra BBC Radio One Extra's Throwback Party, which is just a great listen for an hour, where we said, imagine you're in a kitchen with your best friend at a house party. That's what we want. And she's been able to deliver that. And her personality shines through, and she's gone on to get other work with the BBC and so on.
And that's really interesting because you used format in your description there, because there are, I guess, when somebody's starting out as a podcast, potential podcast, or thinking about it, they're faced with I mean, even the podcast show was somewhat overwhelming because there was just so much content, where do they start? But I think format is an important point that you raise. What type of format will work for me? So do you want to just enlighten our audience about that?
So formats are a bit like sandwiches, I say to people. When I say, what's a sandwich? You know what a sandwich is. It's 2 bits of bread with a filling in the middle. Now, you can change that filling, you could change the type of bread, but you know what it is, you know what the structure is. And often as creatives, we want to make something new all the time. But for the audience, it can be quite disorientating. If they know, for instance, you have as you can see behind me, I have a passion for music, and every week that I'm going to come up with my classic album. I tell you what the album was, what year it came out, and something you didn't know about the album. That's a format. And the reason why that works for the audience is they know they're coming to you, they get that content again and again and again. Formats are something that allows you to be consistent, because one of the challenges with creating content is real consistency. And if you get the right format, if you get the right type of structure for your sandwich, you can add, today we're putting ham in there, tomorrow it's turkey, it's falafel the week after, but it's that format that your audience gets used to and know you for. And it's a lot easier to translate that into something else once you've got a clear format. And we found from creating podcasts, from starting out with going into the studio and just switching the microphone on and seeing what happens, to delivering something which is a lot more clear, a lot more coherent, and a lot more successful in terms of engagement when it is formatted. This is our introduction. This is how we get into the conversation. This is what we talk about next. This is the takeaway. And if we don't have those elements in the podcast, it kind of flies away and the audience really don't stay with it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because all of my shows are always with guests, but I have thought about at times changing that format and doing some solo ones, and but you just don't always know what. And I think sometimes as podcast hosts, we relish feedback, but we rarely get it. But I know I've got friends of mine that are radio hosts, and it's the equivalent of having a radio show. People don't necessarily comment and like. That doesn't mean to say that they don't like it. They're just not necessarily giving you that sort of feedback. So in an ideal world, if you were now to create a new podcast and like you could do it on anything with anyone, what would that look like?
Oh, gosh. I think for me, what I found works well is when you get the audience involved. And I think what I'd like to do is to create formats that start with the audience. What is it that you want to know? If it was a live show, it would be the equivalent of, give us 4 ingredients. And by the end of this hour, from your suggestions, we would have created a dish. So someone says an aubergine and an egg and, a potato and...
so there's like open mic night and a comedy event where actually the show is largely driven by comments from the audience, and they almost create a whole little funny story on the basis of that.
Exactly. And it would be great to do that with a podcast, with a format where your audience, make the suggestions of the inputs and then your guests create the outputs from it. So that could either be a type of agony aunt scenario, whether that's personal or for business. My business is struggling with this, and this, and then your guests kind of unpack that and deliver an outcome. Or it could be something really random where actually you have different points along the podcast where you pick out a new, it's a bit like pick your own adventure stories. A quarter of the way through, you pick out a new suggestion which takes you in a different direction, and then your audience have been involved in building the story.
Yeah. No, and now one of the big issues that I know a lot of content creators have is generating an income from that. And there are different ways in which they can do that. And I was amazed actually. For somebody gave me a stat once that suggested that my podcast was in the top 10% of all podcasts. I was thinking, how has that happened? I've got a reasonably good audience, but it doesn't sit. And one of the reasons is because if you look at all of the podcasts that are out there, millions of them, a lot of them don't last that long, i.e. people give up. So, we talked about earlier consistency, didn't we? But how frequent in your eyes should you be posting a podcast, and how long should each episode be?
I think that's part of a broader question. This is what we've learned, which is it isn't just about how frequently you post the podcast up, but how consistently, how frequently you are in touch with your audience.
Right.
So you could put the podcast up once a month, but maybe weekly there are touch points. So first week is when the podcast comes out and you do your broad post about the podcast. The second week is where your social media assets go out. The third week is when you do your communication, your Twitter conversations around the podcast. The fourth week is we're going into recording the next episode. Here's what we're thinking about going to the next episode. So it's really not just about posting, but really engaging with your audience throughout the process. Audiences love to be involved in podcasts. And, I think there's a figure was banding around about 2 years ago where less than around 80% of podcasts receive less than 200 listens. That's 80% of all the podcasts receive less than 200 listens.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is quite powerful.
It is actually. Yeah. So those that are literally shining through are in this very
top 20%.
Yeah.
And those that are making the millions are probably in 5% of that. Top 5%.
Or probably even less than that.
Probably even less.
Yeah.
So being consistent and really engaging with the audience and tapping into that audience is key.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things is that we shouldn't always be het up by the follower numbers, but the relevance of the followers, shouldn't we? Because you could say, well, actually, if you've got an episode on cooking or an episode on well-being, which has a much wider, broad audience, versus one that is maybe a lot more niche in business, for example. Or one on cybersecurity that again is quite niche and specialist, you may have a much smaller audience, but by the very nature of the subject matter, you are going to get people that are closely aligned for that, which means that an advertiser could find that more attractive. Am I right in thinking that?
And yes, they'll stick with you longer. Having a business podcast is one thing, but having a business podcast for creatives who are looking at leveling up their business. So going from being a two-man band to getting some investment, relocating to a bigger space, moving out of their sheds or their bedrooms or their living rooms, that is a specific audience. And those listeners will engage with you more than just doing a broad business, because someone who's running an accountancy business doesn't have necessarily all the same needs as someone who's running a creative business or a childcare business. So being really distinct about the audience that you go for. And the lesson you also learn as you do this is when you look at the stats, you think you're in South London, as I am, you think you're speaking to a broadly UK audience, and then you realize that 60% of your audience is coming from Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
So very quickly you think, well, how do I engage with my Canadian audiences more?
Yeah. And it's a really good point, actually. For some reason, I've got an American and a UK audience, but I've got some spike in Denmark.
Right. Yes.
And I cannot figure out what that is. I must just have a few fans there that keep popping up. But it is quite interesting. So yeah, it's another tip, isn't it? Is know your numbers. Keep looking and reviewing. Why did that episode work well? I think as well, for me, and it'd be good to get your take, is when you've got guests on, is those that share the episodes, and I mean really share it to their audience, can have a profound impact. And if I look at the episodes where I know that they've gone above and beyond, they are the episodes that have definitely done far better than those that haven't.
Yeah. And that tends to be because you're speaking to your core audience. They already know about your podcast.
Yes, of course.
Your guest's audience doesn't necessarily know about your podcast. Correct. So them sharing it with their audience brings in a brand new audience on top of the base that you already have.
Yeah. I think as well, it makes them look good by what I would call social advocacy, because they're not necessarily promoting themselves. They're giving their audience an opportunity to hear them on somebody else's show. As well, which gives them that sort of level of independence.
And one of the things, just on that point, one of the things that we started doing is not just saying to your guests, could you promote your episode? But when we invite them to come onto the podcast, we send them something that they could share to say, hey, I'm going to be on this podcast soon. So you get two hits, if you like.
That's a good
idea. You get the, I'm going to be on this podcast. Check it out. What do you think I should talk about? ask their own audience. And then when the episode comes out, it's almost rewarding their audience for that work that they've done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And because people's attention spans are less, are you thinking that a typical podcast should be 20 minutes to half an hour, or does it depend on the episode? But I used to do them at the beginning that were an hour, but I'm now within the 20 minutes to 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's where we land for interview-based formats. When we're doing things that are a bit more narrative, some sound design stuff, then we're more in the 40 minutes. But essentially, yeah, people will they make their decision by looking at the title, the artwork, the description, and they don't really spend a lot of time on the description. So you've got to get them in the first couple of sentences.
Yeah.
And the duration, the amount of times people look at the duration of a podcast and go, am I going to give this thing that I'm taking a chance on an hour?
Yeah.
So what you may want to do in terms of your podcast strategy is have your earlier episodes shorter than maybe the ones that are episode 16 onwards. Yeah. Because then your audience have bought in.
No, I understand that. And I noticed that more and more podcasters are using video clips and shorts to promote like 30 seconds sound bites that they can then share so people can get a taster for it. I think it's also worth mentioning, because a lot of people I've spoken to have realized that there's not much engagement on LinkedIn. But you have to remember that LinkedIn is not a format for podcasts anyway. So although it may be that you're sharing it, it's not something that because if people want to listen to podcasts, they will go on to.
Yes.
Yeah. And what about stuff like putting some spend behind one or two of your? I mean, I have never done that.
Yeah.
But I am I have been thinking about doing that and using like some hero episodes to really put some money behind. What do you think?
That's what we do with our social media posts. So we take the post from the podcast organically for the first few days. We see which of the posts, which of the clips are doing the work. And then we put some money behind those because obviously they're engaging with the audience, and try to get some insights about why this particular post is engaging with the audience. And then what we do is we go back to our podcast episode and rewrite the descriptions heroing the clip that you've seen on social media. So we might just tweak it a little bit. If there's a particular speaker who was on the post that engaged, we might move them further up the billing, or maybe use one of their quotes from the clip that's going viral, so to speak, into the description.
And what's your view about promoting an episode that you did like 2-3 months ago?
Oh yes, always. As much as you can, although knowledge is evergreen, right? My grandmother will tell me something that will, be useful to me and also to my grandkids. So knowledge is evergreen.
Yes.
So as long as you can pick out from your podcast the nuggets of knowledge from them, really mine them. Yes, there's personality stuff. Yes, there's banter stuff. Yes, there's entertainment stuff. But there'll be real nuggets that you can pull out, which will help, especially if you're working in marketing or business or anything that can be passed on from generation to generation, from viewer to viewer, from listener to listener.
Yeah.
Then pull those out and make sure that they are part of your offer and your description. Maybe change your title after a while. The thing that Netflix does all the time and always suckers us in is they keep changing the picture, and you think, have I seen this or haven't I seen this? So we will, regularly change the artwork.
And I mean, I break mine down into seasons. Is that a good strategy in your eyes? Versus like, I'm now at like 216th episode, whereas I break mine into season 5, season 4, and so on.
Seasons is a lot better, a lot cleaner way to curate your podcast episode. It's great to say, this is episode 195. It's a bit of a vanity metric because you can still say I've got 195 episodes across 40 seasons.
Yeah.
So but seasons really make it easier to curate. And also, if you've got commercial relationships, it's a lot better because it allows you to be flexible with sponsors to say, well, if you want to sponsor season 2 as well, it's a different tariff.
Yeah. And do you tend to, when you're looking at a brand to sponsor a podcast, might it be one episode or might it be a series of episodes? Do you go and create content somewhat aligned with the sponsor, or do you are effective the sponsors coming in because of the pretty much the show as it is, and they're just adding their advertising? And just to add to that, do you is that advertising in a show read, or is it an external audio clip inserted within the mid-roll?
Yeah, so what we found, lesson learned here, was advertisers aren't coming for the personalities. They're not coming for the podcast itself.
Correct.
They're coming for the audience that the podcast pulls. So we saying, hey, we've got this guy, he's really great, and he's a great talker and he can get loads of great guests. They say, well, who are you speaking to? Who's your audience, and how many of them are there? So a point would be, whenever you're seeking a relationship with a sponsor or an advertiser, lead with those stats, lead with the numbers. We're talking to women aged between 25 and 45. This is the thing that's important to them. Oh, when we happen to have a guest who speaks directly to them. We happen to have a host. We happen to have a podcast that works for them. Once you start having those relationships, just from a return on investment point of view, advertisers will want as many eyes, as many ears on their brand and their product as possible. So it's probably not in their interest to advertise on just one episode.
No. And
probably not for yours either, because you don't want to keep doing the work for each episode.
Yeah.
It's easier to say, we have a season, you can be our partner for the whole season. A season is 15 episodes, and you get exposure on all of them. Then you can say, and the rate is, for us, it's £200 per episode. Yeah.
No, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. And is that, you just said £200, is that an average, or do you
£200 it's a fairly good rate for people to spend on advertising. It's the equivalent to what you would spend on radio ads. So right. Brands and sponsors are used to that. It won't pay all your production costs, but it will help you do what you need to do. Yeah. Again, it's coming back to understanding that podcasts and sponsorship for podcasts don't necessarily pay all the bills, but it helps you get enough of the way to do other stuff. So things like monetization from merchandising, from live events, from taking your one amazing podcast and turning that into a stage show. So for instance, how my podcast went viral. You might have one episode which for some unknown reason went viral. Well, something like the podcast show is a great place to talk about that single episode that went viral, and over half an hour, break down the things that your podcast was about, the guest that you had on it, why you picked that guest, what it was that made that particular thing go viral, when you found out it was going viral, what you did to capitalize on it. All of that becomes a stage show that you can take out to a number of different venues, including your mysterious audience in the Netherlands or in Canada, to doing a show in Canada, which then brings you another. And
it's interesting you say that. I've never done a podcast live, but I am thinking of doing that in the not too distant future, because video, of course, plays a greater significance. The only reason I haven't done that is because that requires investment and time, and and actually having somebody else alongside you, and you've got to know that you're going to get a return on that investment. However, that said, I know that before we had this recording, we were having a chat beforehand about creators should look at what they're doing is entrepreneurial, the entrepreneurialism of podcasting. And sometimes it's about building your personal brand credentials, and thinking, I might not make money today, but I will in the future as long as I'm consistent with what I'm doing. So do you want to just elaborate on that?
Yes. So we speak to our creators as, imagine someone came to you and said, hey, I'd like to be part of your project. I've written 16 books on education. immediately you think, oh, they must know something about education. Well, we're in the world where the podcast can also give you that kudos to say, I've got 3 seasons on a podcast on business or a podcast on accounting or sports psychology, gives you that credibility. So podcasts can be used to grow your credibility in a particular space, not just, providing you an income. It might do, but it might not. But making sure that as you put content out, you make sure it's the thing that allows you to have credibility in that space, especially if you're thinking of writing a book, for instance. Test your theories out in a podcast. So over 10 episodes of your podcast, thinking I want to write a book about, West African entrepreneurs, for instance, knowing that there is a massive growth rate in Africa. People are moving over to Africa to do more and more business. You want to write a book about that. So you interview 10 West African entrepreneurs. That becomes the basis of your book. You transcribe all of that. And on the header of your book, you say, based on the leading podcast series, because, well, there's only one, isn't there? Yours, the leading podcast series about West African entrepreneurship. So all of a sudden, it starts to work in your favor. But that podcast has helped build your credibility in the space, which allows you to do other stuff. One of the things that we do, just to tie the two things together, one of the things that we do is we have a show, which is a live show called 7 Secrets of Immersive Storytelling. Because one of the things that people kept saying to us about our podcast was, we really like the way you've done the sound design. Are there any tips you can give us in there? So we have this stage show, which is 7 Secrets of Immersive Storytelling, where we say, well, here's how you can use your music. Here's how you can use your atmosphere. Here's what you can do with your script. Here's how you can use silence, for instance, in your podcast production. And we show examples across a different range of podcasts.
Nice.
So all of it is about building credibility in what you do. And you might find out that people aren't interested in your podcast per se, but how do you structure your questions? You might be a great interviewer, and that becomes your show. How do you go out and create these great interviews with people that, I always like to listen out to interviews where the guest says, that's a good question.
Yeah, exactly.
For me, it means it's a question that they haven't been asked for and they have to think about in a new way.
Yeah. No, I agree. Which is the reason why I asked you if you could create any podcast.
Yeah, it did make me think of it. That's a great actually, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been really insightful, and it's lovely to chat with a fellow podcaster. How can people find out more about you?
So follow us on everything. We are Unedited. So we are Unedited on everything. All the socials and the website as well. weareunedited.com.
Right. Lovely. Thank you, Bernard, so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.